It was a moonless night over the North Sea, February 1943. The air was cold enough to turn a pilot's breath into tiny clouds of ice inside his mask. Far below, the black water shimmered faintly beneath scattered beams of searchlights sweeping the sky. Somewhere out there, a formation of RAF bombers was returning from another raid on Germany. Exhausted crews, frostbitten faces, and engines coughing through the dark. Inside a German radar control room near Bremen, cigarette smoke curled through the air as officers leaned over their scopes. Their equipment flickered with static. One officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Amerikanische Technik," he muttered. American technology. He didn't believe those clumsy Allied machines could see anything in this kind of darkness. But hundreds of miles away, inside a quiet brick building on the English coast, an American radar operator already had them locked on his green glowing screen. The bombers were not alone, and neither were the hunters. That night, a silent race began, one side relying on eyesight, the other guided by invisible waves. And by dawn, German officers would no longer be laughing. When World War II began in September 1939, the world still believed wars would be won with guns, tanks, and brave men who could see their enemy. The idea that invisible radio waves could decide a battle sounded like science fiction. Yet far from the front lines, a small number of scientists in Britain and America were working on something extraordinary, a technology that could see without eyes. Before radar had a name, it was simply called RDF, Radio Direction Finding. Britain's scientists, led by Robert Watson Watt, had already built a chain of tall steel towers along their southern coast. They called it the Chain Home System, and by the time Germany's Luftwaffe attacked in 1940, it became Britain's unseen shield. While the world watched dogfights over the English Channel, few knew that those victories had started minutes earlier on radar screens deep underground. Operators, often young women barely in their 20s, watched green dots move across black glass and whispered coordinates to Fighter Command. It was quiet, patient work, and it changed everything. But across the Atlantic, in the United States, radar was still a mystery. America was not yet in the war. Its military leaders knew little about what the British were hiding behind their coastal fences. In fact, some in Washington dismissed radar as a European experiment. That changed in 1940, when the British, desperate for help, sent a secret mission to America, the Tizard mission. Inside one small metal suitcase lay a treasure of Allied technology. The designs for the Spitfire supercharger, a jet engine prototype, and something called the cavity magnetron. It was that small copper device, not much larger than a teacup, that turned the tide of the entire radar war. Unlike older British radars that used long radio waves, the magnetron could generate microwaves, thousands of times more precise, powerful, and compact. It allowed radar sets to shrink from the size of a building to the size of a briefcase, small enough to fit inside an airplane. When the Americans saw it, they realized instantly what it meant. In October 1940, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology created the Radiation Laboratory, known simply as the RAD Lab. Its task: develop radar for air, sea, and land, faster than Germany could imagine. Soon, hundreds of scientists worked around the clock under strict secrecy. Physicists like Ernest Lawrence and II Rabi joined engineers and soldiers to perfect airborne radar that could spot enemy planes or submarines in total darkness. The work was dangerous, intense, and done under wartime urgency. In dimly lit laboratories, engineers tuned cathode ray screens until faint blips of light appeared, then faded again. Each spark on that glass meant a plane, a ship, or a life saved. They called these devices SCR-270, SCR-517, and H2X. Each was a small step toward turning invisible energy into vision. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America's radar network was still young and underused. Ironically, an early warning radar in Hawaii had detected the incoming Japanese aircraft that morning, but its report was dismissed as friendly bombers. That mistake haunted American commanders and fueled a determination. Radar would never be ignored again. From that moment onward, radar development became a national obsession. By 1942, new radar units began appearing on every U.S. ship and aircraft. The Navy installed them on destroyers to hunt submarines in the Atlantic. The Army fitted them on bombers to navigate through fog and night. And in secret factories, American women soldered delicate circuits that would one day guide pilots home through storm and darkness. Yet, across Europe, German officers still laughed. They believed no machine could replace the skill of a trained pilot's eyes or the discipline of a searchlight crew. The Luftwaffe relied on its own radar systems, Freya and Würzburg, but used them mainly for defensive tracking, not offense. They underestimated how radar could guide an attack, not just warn against one. To them, radar was a tool, not a weapon. To the Americans, it was about to become both. And as Allied factories began producing radar sets by the thousands, the balance of the air war started to shift, quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. Because radar did not just help pilots find their targets, it began to teach them something more dangerous: where the enemy would be next.
While American scientists labored in secrecy, the German Luftwaffe stood at the height of its confidence. By 1941, it had swept across Europe, from Warsaw to Paris, with a force unmatched in speed and coordination. To its commanders, Germany's air power was the symbol of modern warfare: bold, mechanical, and unstoppable. Their pilots were the elite of Europe. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, dominated the skies. Their night fighter squadrons, led by men like Josef Kammhuber, had turned the air defense of the Reich into a precise machine. And yet, in the heart of this well-oiled system, a silent weakness grew: the inability to see without light. Germany's first radar systems, Freya and Würzburg, were technological achievements in their own right. Freya could detect aircraft more than 100 kilometers away. Würzburg could track them for anti-aircraft guns. Together, they formed the backbone of what the Germans proudly called the Kammhuber line, a belt of radar-guided searchlights and night fighters stretching from Denmark to France. Each radar sector was known as a Himmelbett, meaning canopy bed. In theory, when Allied bombers entered a Himmelbett zone, radar would spot them, searchlights would illuminate them, and fighters would finish the job. It was a sophisticated system, neat, organized, and deadly. At first. But the Luftwaffe made one fatal assumption. They believed radar was a static tool, a watcher, not a hunter. Their doctrine relied on human vision to complete the kill. When bombers came in waves, when clouds rolled in, or when darkness deepened, the system's precision fell apart. German crews joked that radar was blind in the rain. By 1942, the RAF had begun flying deeper and faster into German airspace. Their bombers, guided by G and H-2S radar sets, developed in Britain and improved by American engineers, could navigate even when the moon disappeared behind thick cloud. Soon, entire bombing raids were being guided not by starlight, but by signals invisible to the human eye. To German officers, this seemed impossible. Some dismissed it as luck. Others blamed traitors or weather. They simply could not imagine that the Allies had achieved radar systems small enough to be mounted inside an aircraft, because their own scientists had declared it impossible. Back in Berlin, Hitler's inner circle viewed radar with both pride and suspicion. They celebrated early successes with the Würzburg system and its precision, but they saw radar as defensive, not decisive. Hitler's faith was in offense, in rockets, artillery, and blitzkrieg. In his mind, wars were won with momentum and courage, not with quiet machines that hummed in the dark. Meanwhile, deep inside Allied laboratories, the Americans were mastering something else entirely: electronic warfare. They discovered that radar wasn't just about detection. It could be used to confuse the enemy, to jam his signals, to make his guns shoot at shadows. By the time Germany realized this, the Allies were already developing countermeasures like window, thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to blind German radar. When these clouds of foil floated down, German screens filled with false echoes, hundreds of phantom aircraft. Their air defense network, once so precise, became a hall of mirrors. The frustration inside Luftwaffe Command grew. Reports from radar stations conflicted. Night fighter squadrons scrambled in the wrong directions. Searchlights illuminated empty skies. Still, some German engineers tried to adapt. They experimented with Liechtenstein airborne radar for night fighters, hoping to catch bombers in the dark. But Allied scientists quickly developed radar detectors to locate and evade those signals too. The radar war had turned into a deadly chess game, with every move met by a faster counter. And in this invisible war, speed mattered more than pride. The Americans could produce in months what German laboratories took years to perfect. By 1943, the Allies were building thousands of radar units every week. Small, reliable, and simple enough for any crewman to use. Germany's production lagged behind, trapped in the weight of bureaucracy and overconfidence. The irony was bitter. A nation that once led in engineering was now being outpaced by nations that once admired it. As 1943 dawned, radar had become the unseen battlefield that decided who lived and who died before the first bomb was dropped. It was no longer a secret tool. It was the nervous system of the Allied war machine. And yet, in the corridors of Luftwaffe Command, the laughter continued. German officers still mocked reports of radar-guided bombers and radio beam navigation. They called them Allied fantasies, tricks of propaganda. But high above Europe, the night skies were about to change forever. For soon, those same fantasies would turn every German mission into a journey through a death trap, built not of fire or steel, but of invisible light.
1. The technological angle, the machine that could see the invisible. Radar's genius lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. A pulse of radio energy would be sent into the air. It would travel outward, strike something solid, and return as an echo. A receiver would measure how long it took for that echo to come back. That delay, converted into distance, told an operator where something was, and sometimes even how fast it was moving. On a darkened radar screen, those returning echoes appeared as tiny glowing dots. Each dot could be an aircraft, a ship, or sometimes just a storm. To the untrained eye, it was meaningless, but to the trained operator, those blips told stories. Inside radar huts across Britain and the US, men and women sat in silence, eyes fixed on green light. Their world was a hum of electricity and faint voices through headphones. When a new signal appeared, they would call out calm, precise words. Target, bearing 180, range 30 miles. Each phrase could decide whether a bomber lived or died. Radar transformed warfare by stripping away the cover of night. For the first time in human history, darkness no longer belonged to the enemy. Before radar, wars at night were ruled by chance. Pilots often never saw the enemy until it was too late. But radar gave them eyes in the dark. It could spot aircraft through fog, storms, and moonless nights. It replaced fear with information. And in war, information is the most powerful weapon of all. 2. The tactical angle. How radar changed the battle itself. Radar didn't just reveal targets, it reorganized how wars were fought. Commanders no longer relied on scouts or lucky sightings. Now, they had a real-time map of the sky. In Britain, radar stations would detect approaching aircraft long before they reached the coast. Information traveled to Fighter Command, where officers used giant plotting tables covered in colored blocks to represent squadrons. From there,
Radio orders went to pilots waiting on airfields. Within minutes, Spitfires or Hurricanes would rise into the air and intercept bombers with near-perfect timing. For the Germans, this coordination was almost magical. They couldn't understand how British fighters always seemed to appear exactly where they were needed. To them, it looked like luck or a spy network. In truth, it was the calm voice of a radar operator miles away, guiding unseen aircraft with invisible precision. The Americans took this concept and expanded it on an industrial scale. By 1943, radar networks covered entire continents. U.S. radar installations protected convoys in the Atlantic, guided bombers over Europe, and guarded the Pacific Islands. On ships, radar became the captain's sixth sense. At night or in stormy seas, commanders could still see the horizon. They could track enemy ships, avoid collisions, and even detect periscopes of submarines breaking the surface. Radar also changed the tempo of battle. Where once war had been reactive, waiting to see where the enemy attacked, now it became predictive. Commanders could plan around what radar told them might happen next. It was like reading the enemy's movements before they made them. And with every new development, the Allies' advantage grew. German forces were still operating by sight and sound. Allied forces were operating by science. 3. The human angle, the silent watchers. For all its technical brilliance, radar was nothing without the people behind it. In dim, crowded rooms, hundreds of young men and women sat before flickering screens, eyes aching from the glow. They were often the first to know when danger was coming, and the last to look away when it passed. They called it watching the green eye. A faint sweep of light would circle the display once every few seconds, leaving a trail of fading echoes. Operators learned to read those whispers of energy like words on a page. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't wear wings or medals. They rarely saw daylight. But their calm voices guided pilots home through storms, warned convoys of approaching submarines, and directed bombers to their targets in black skies. Many were barely out of school. In Britain, women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force filled the radar rooms, replacing the men who had gone to fight. They endured long shifts, fatigue, and the heavy silence that came between transmissions. Sometimes they watched entire bomber formations vanish from their screens, dots blinking out one by one. They never saw the explosions, but they knew what it meant. Yet they kept working, marking the last known positions, relaying the final coordinates, because that was their duty. Radar for them was both a lifeline and a burden. They saw what others could not, and sometimes what others should not. To the older officers who dismissed radar as unreliable, these quiet operators were proof of its power. They didn't speak of science or theory. They just watched and warned and saved lives. And it was this human calm behind the machine that gave radar its true strength. The radar war was no longer just about electricity and physics. It had become a battle of patience, discipline, and silent courage, fought not in the skies, but in dark rooms filled with humming machines. And yet, as powerful as these systems had become, the Germans still refused to believe they could be decisive. They thought radar could watch, but not kill. They were about to learn how wrong they were.
4. The enemy angle, when confidence turns to confusion. For the Luftwaffe, radar began as a curiosity, an engineering experiment, not a weapon. They had been early innovators, yes. The Freya and Würzburg systems were solid achievements, but their focus remained narrow: detect bombers, guide guns, report positions. The Germans believed their Himmelbett defense line would protect them forever, but it had a fatal flaw. It was rigid. Each radar sector could only handle one interception at a time. When the RAF began sending hundreds of bombers in wide formations, the system collapsed. Suddenly, the once orderly skies turned chaotic. Screens overflowed with targets. Radio channels jammed. Night fighter crews scrambled in circles, chasing echoes that led nowhere. And then came window. In July 1943, During the bombing of Hamburg, the RAF released millions of thin aluminum strips into the night sky. Each strip reflected radar waves, creating a storm of false contacts. German operators watched in disbelief as their screens lit up with hundreds of phantom aircraft. Their radar network, once their pride, became useless. Officers shouted for recalibration, thinking the instruments were malfunctioning. Technicians tore apart circuits searching for faults, but there was none. Radar had been blinded not by failure, but by deception. It was the moment Germany realized the Allies weren't just matching their technology, they were outthinking it. From that night onward, the Luftwaffe's faith in radar began to crumble. Every signal became suspect. Every blip on the screen could be a ghost. The weapon they once mocked turned into the thing they feared most, an unseen enemy that could manipulate what they saw. 5. The psychological angle. The night was no longer safe. Before radar, Germany was allies. Darkness protected its factories, its railways, and its cities. Pilots felt safer under the cover of black skies, believing that bombers could never find them. But radar changed that forever. Suddenly, darkness became a trap. It no longer hid, it exposed. The very thing they trusted most became the thing that betrayed them. Pilots described flying missions where the searchlights would not find them, but somehow Allied fighters still did. Night fighters would take off, confident and composed, only to find themselves intercepted in what they thought was empty air. Invisible eyes were tracking them, guiding enemy aircraft directly to their positions. The psychological toll was immense. Veterans who once laughed at radio magic began whispering about Allied radar as if it were a curse, an invisible force that saw through clouds and shadows. In mess halls and barracks, stories spread. The Americans can see us even when we can't see ourselves. For many, the sky lost its meaning. What was once a place of dominance became a place of dread. Even the sound of their own radar pings, that rhythmic pulse, began to feel like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. Radar was more than a technological shift. It was a psychological weapon. It removed the comfort of uncertainty. There was nowhere left to hide. 6. The leadership angle. The generals who believed and those who didn't. In any war, leadership determines how new technology is used or ignored. And in the radar war, leadership made all the difference. On the Allied side, visionaries like General Henry Hap Arnold of the U.S. Air Forces and Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding of Britain understood what radar could do. They didn't see it as a gadget. They saw it as a strategy, a network that connected pilots, ships, and bases into one living organism. Dowding's early investment in Britain's radar chain had already saved his country during the Battle of Britain. Arnold followed that same path, integrating radar into every aspect of American air operations, from bomber navigation to coastal defense. He knew that whoever mastered radar would master the skies. Across the front lines, however, German leadership faltered. Some engineers, like Hans Hullemann and Ernst Kramer, warned that the Allies were far ahead. They pushed for faster production, for smaller magnetrons, for airborne radar. But their warnings were often buried under layers of command bureaucracy. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously dismissed Allied radar intelligence reports as British fantasy. Hitler himself saw radar as a support tool, something that helped the defense, not something that could decide a war. He demanded vengeance weapons, rockets, and jet fighters, while the Allies invested in invisibility. This leadership blindness proved fatal. By 1943, Allied radar intelligence could track German aircraft even as they took off. They knew where fighter groups were forming,
which airfields were active, and which targets were vulnerable. The Germans, meanwhile, were reacting to ghosts, still trusting their eyes while the Allies trusted their instruments. 7. The moral angle. The invisible edge of modern warfare. There was also a quiet unease among some who worked in radar. For all its brilliance, radar made killing easier. It removed the face of the enemy. You didn't see the pilot you destroyed, only a light fading on a screen. Operators who had guided bombers over targets began to realize what those bright dots represented. Every return signal could mean hundreds of lives below. Radar had turned war into numbers, distances, and coordinates, efficient, mechanical, and detached. Yet in that detachment, there was also humanity, because radar, in many cases, saved far more lives than it took. It prevented mid-air collisions. It guided lost air crews home. It kept convoys together in storms that would have swallowed them whole. Radar didn't just make war deadlier, it made survival possible. And in the balance between destruction and preservation, mankind found itself standing at the threshold of a new era, one where battles would be fought not just with fire and steel, but with information itself. Radar had now reshaped the human, tactical, and psychological landscape of the war. But its greatest demonstration, the moment when disbelief turned to dread, was still to come. Because in 1943 and 1944, American radar would unleash its full power in the skies over Europe, and Germany would finally see what it had ignored for too long.
8. The turning point, when America's invisible eyes opened over Europe. It began quietly. No roaring engines, no bombs falling, just faint pulses echoing through the sky. By late 1943, American bombers were flying deeper into occupied Europe, to Bremen, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt. The German High Command expected heavy losses to force the U.S. to retreat. But something strange happened. The bombers kept coming back. They weren't wandering. They weren't missing their targets. They flew in tight formations, right on schedule, even through clouds that should have blinded them. To German radar operators, this was impossible. How were the Americans navigating through weather and flak without losing their way? The answer was hidden inside a small metal box, the H-2X radar, nicknamed Mickey. Mounted in the nose of the B-17 and B-24 bombers, it allowed crews to see the ground through clouds and darkness. Factories, bridges, and cities appeared as glowing shapes on the radar screen. Now, no storm could protect a target, and no night could hide the enemy. When the first radar-guided raids struck Hamburg and Berlin, German civilians recalled how bombers appeared as if guided by some supernatural force. Searchlights swept the sky in vain. The clouds glowed orange as fire spread across the city. Even in total fog, the bombs landed with eerie precision. Inside the Luftwaffe command bunkers, disbelief turned to alarm. Officers demanded reports from radar stations, weather teams, and intelligence units. Impossible, they said. They can't see us, not in this weather. But they could, and they did, again and again. 9. The Atlantic War. Radar turns the tide beneath the waves. While bombers ruled the sky, another war raged silently below. The Battle of the Atlantic, the fight between Allied convoys and German U-boats, had been Germany's best hope to starve Britain into submission. For years, the U-boats had hunted at night, surfacing under darkness to attack. But by 1943, something changed. U-boats began disappearing. Crews reported being spotted even in pitch-black conditions. Some said they were attacked before their lookouts even sighted a plane.
It was as if Allied aircraft had eyes that could pierce the ocean's veil. Those eyes were airborne radar, the ASV, Air-to-Surface Vessel Radar System. Mounted on patrol planes like the B-24 Liberator and PBY Catalina, it could detect a submarine periscope from miles away. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. German sailors described the terror of hearing a plane's engines closing in when they had seen nothing on the horizon. Their searchlights never caught the aircraft. It appeared out of nowhere, unleashing depth charges and disappearing back into the clouds. The U-boat captains called it der unsichtbare Tod, the invisible death. By mid-1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz admitted the truth. Radar, not luck, was destroying his fleet. In May alone, Germany lost 41 submarines, more than in any previous month of the war. The ocean that once belonged to them had become a graveyard. 10. The German counterattack. Desperate measures. Germany tried to fight back. They developed radar detectors like the Metox and later the Naxos, devices that could pick up Allied radar signals before they were spotted. But by the time they detected a plane, it was already too late. Then came their boldest move, the Klein-Heidelberg radar, designed to bounce signals off British transmissions and spy back on the enemy. It was ingenious, but clumsy. Its data came too slowly, and its accuracy too poor to strike back effectively. While German scientists raced to close the gap, the Allies had already leaped ahead again, introducing centimetric radar, powered by the secret cavity magnetron. It was smaller, faster, deadlier, and invisible to German detectors. Now, even when U-boats submerged, radar-equipped aircraft could still find them by the faint ripples they left on the surface. No escape, no safety. Not even the darkness could hide them anymore. 11. The moment of realization, when fear became fact. In late 1943, captured German officers were interrogated at Allied camps. When shown radar displays, they refused to believe them. One officer reportedly laughed and said, "No man can see through clouds." But when he was taken to an airfield and watched a bomber locate a hidden ship in total fog using radar alone, he stood silent for minutes. Then he whispered, "This changes everything." It was a confession born not of defeat, but of awe. Radar had rewritten the laws of war and of human imagination. For centuries, men fought with what they could see. Now, they fought with what they could not. The invisible battlefield had arrived. 12. The German collapse of faith. By early 1944, radar's presence was everywhere, from guiding Allied bombers to leading invasion fleets across the Channel. It even directed the D-Day landings, timing every movement to the second. German generals knew then that radar wasn't just a tool, it was an entire unseen empire of control. Officers reported strange psychological effects among troops. Radar towers loomed like dark monuments, reminding soldiers that they were being watched. Even the hum of Allied bombers above felt like an unseen eye scanning the earth. Faith in traditional tactics eroded. Confidence vanished. The radar war wasn't just one with electronics, it was one in the mind. The radar advantage had reached its peak, but what came next was something no one expected. The merging of radar and intelligence, turning the air war into a game of anticipation, where the Allies knew their enemy's every move before it happened.
13. The ghost eyes over Normandy. By June 1944, radar had evolved from an experiment into a living nervous system of war. Across the English coast,
Radar masts turned in slow rhythm, like sentinels waiting for the moment of invasion. That moment came on June 6, 1944. At 2 a.m., in the dark silence before dawn, Allied ships and aircraft began moving toward Normandy. Every movement, every course correction was coordinated through radar. From airfields in England to the command ships off the coast, radar stations tracked tens of thousands of planes and vessels as one synchronized storm. The weather was treacherous: fog, wind, rough seas. But radar didn't care about weather. As long as the pulse could bounce, the invasion could move. When German coastal batteries opened fire, Allied ships countered instantly, using radar to track the shells' paths and adjust their aim. On the beaches, landing craft were guided through smoke and confusion by radar beacons, coded Eureka and Rebecca. To the naked eye, D-Day looked chaotic. To radar, it was order in motion. By the time the sun rose, 156,000 men had landed, not by luck, but by invisible precision. In post-war interrogations, German officers admitted they never saw the invasion coming. Their own radar screens had been jammed by a storm of false signals, a brilliant Allied tactic known as window. Thousands of thin aluminum strips dropped from aircraft to create fake echoes. Their scopes were blinded by ghosts. While the Germans stared at hundreds of false blips, the real invasion force moved quietly beneath the noise. The death trap had closed. 14. The air war becomes an equation. By the summer of 1944, radar had given the Allies what every commander dreams of: foresight. From underground bunkers in Britain, radar and intelligence officers used a growing network called Chain Home to track Luftwaffe aircraft the instant they lifted off. Each signal was logged, mapped, and sent to RAF and U.S. fighter command posts within minutes. For the first time in history, air defense became mathematics. Angles, distances, altitudes, all calculated in seconds. By the time German fighters reached the Channel, Allied squadrons were already waiting in perfect intercept positions. To the Germans, it felt like sorcery. To the Americans, it was science. In one recorded engagement near the Pas de Calais, a German pilot described how he was ambushed before even reaching altitude. He later told interrogators, "They knew where we were before we did." That was the power of radar intelligence, the invisible hand guiding every Allied move. Even the mighty V-1 flying bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapons, were tracked and destroyed mid-air by radar-directed guns and fighters. In London, spotters no longer relied solely on their eyes. Radar predicted where the bombs would fall. Each interception saved hundreds of lives. By the end of 1944, radar had rewritten not just the battlefield, but the entire idea of warfare itself. 15. The fall of the invisible wall. Germany scientists fought desperately to keep pace. They deployed radar jammers, night fighter systems, and decoy beacons, but every countermeasure only worked for a few weeks. The Allies' technology evolved faster than Germany could react. The Luftwaffe's famed night fighter force, once unstoppable, began to crumble. Its secret weapon, the Liechtenstein radar, was powerful but bulky and easy to jam. Meanwhile, Allied bombers carried small black boxes that emitted constant radar noise, filling German screens with meaningless static. It was a cruel irony: the same invisible waves the Germans had once mocked were now blinding their own defenses. By late 1944, the night sky over the Ruhr Valley had turned into a hell of fire and thunder. Entire industrial cities vanished beneath waves of radar-guided raids. To those on the ground, it seemed like divine punishment, as if the heavens themselves had eyes. German civilians later said the bombing felt predictive, that Allied bombers always knew where the next target was before they could even rebuild. They were right. The radar network, linked with aerial photography and intercepted radio traffic, allowed Allied commanders to map destruction in real time. Every flame was recorded, every target revisited. 16. The War of Shadows ends. By the spring of 1945, the radar war had already been won. When Allied troops crossed the Rhine, they were guided by mobile radar units that tracked everything from artillery shells to troop columns. Germany's own radar sites were falling one by one. Abandoned towers stood like skeletal ghosts over empty fields. Their screens had gone dark. The officers who once mocked radar now stood powerless, watching the empire they swore to defend collapse under invisible blows. On the skies above, radar-directed bombers flew unopposed. No interception, no surprise, just the steady mechanical rhythm of a war already decided. And when Berlin finally fell in May 1945, one of the most guarded Allied secrets was quietly declassified. Radar had shortened the war by at least 2 years. It had turned the tide not with bombs or blood, but with knowledge. The last pulse of the radar screen faded into static. The war of light and darkness was over, but the world it created, the world of guided warfare, of invisible detection, had just begun.
17. The shock of discovery. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied investigators entered Germany not just with tanks and rifles, but with notebooks and questions. They weren't looking for gold or art. They were looking for knowledge. Teams of scientists from Britain and the United States began visiting German radar sites, from the wind-swept coasts of Denmark to the deep forests of Bavaria. What they found left them both impressed and relieved. The Germans had built radar systems of their own, some impressive, even ingenious, but they had always been a step behind. Their radars worked on longer wavelengths, easier to jam and far less precise. Their displays were bulky, slow, and limited. They had never discovered the cavity magnetron, the Allied invention that had made radar small, powerful, and deadly accurate. In bunkers near the Baltic Sea, Allied scientists found stacks of reports, diagrams, and equipment, silent witnesses to Germany's desperate race to catch up. In one underground facility, British officers uncovered a half-finished radar set labeled Würzburg-Riesa, Giant Würzburg. It was enormous, but outdated. The war had moved faster than the engineers could build. German officers, now prisoners, stood quietly as their laboratories were inspected. Many admitted they had underestimated radar from the beginning. They called it the unseen enemy. For them, the laughter that once filled radar rooms in 1942 had long since vanished, replaced by silence and disbelief. 18. The intelligence web. But perhaps the greatest revelation came not from machines, but from organization. The Allies had not just used radar, they had networked it. Post-war reports revealed that every radar pulse, every aircraft signal, every interception log had been fed into a centralized intelligence system. It was the birth of modern data warfare, a concept decades ahead of its time. In British command centers like Bentley Priory and Bawdsey Manor, radar operators, mathematicians, and officers had worked side by side, turning raw signals into living maps of the war. They could see German aircraft taking off, predict their targets, and guide Allied fighters to intercept them before a single bomb was dropped. When German prisoners later saw these integrated radar maps, they were stunned. They had never imagined such coordination was possible. To them, the radar war had seemed random, chaotic, waves and counterwaves. To the Allies, it had been a symphony of precision. 19. The broken faith in darkness. For decades, the Germans had believed that night offered protection, that darkness was their ally. It was a belief shaped by centuries of warfare. When the sun went down, armies hid, regrouped, or struck unseen. Radar destroyed that ancient truth.
By 1945, darkness no longer meant safety. The very element that once concealed the hunter now betrayed him. Every U-boat surfacing at night, every bomber hiding in cloud cover, all became bright spots on an invisible screen. Psychologists who studied captured Luftwaffe pilots found something striking. Many described a persistent fear of being watched. Even long after the war, they dreamed of radar screens, glowing circles that never slept, scanning, waiting. It wasn't paranoia. It was the mark of a war that had reached beyond sight. Radar had changed the meaning of battlefield. It extended the fight into the unseen, into the electromagnetic world. And once humanity crossed that threshold, it could never go back. By 1946, the first generation of radar scientists began to realize what they had created. What began as a tool of survival had opened a new age, one that would soon define not just wars, but peace itself. The Allies held the ultimate advantage, the mastery of invisibility. And from that advantage, a new world order would quietly begin to form.
20. From battlefield to Cold War. When peace returned to Europe, radar towers remained, silent, skeletal reminders of the war's invisible front. But their silence didn't last long. By 1946, both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to adapt wartime radar for a new kind of conflict, one without declared battles, yet more dangerous than any before. The Cold War had begun. In America, the MIT Radiation Laboratory, once devoted to building radar for bombers, was reborn as the Center for Advanced Detection Systems. In the Soviet Union, scientists studied captured German radar equipment and the Allied reports from occupied Europe. Each side now understood that whoever saw first, even in the invisible spectrum, would survive the next war. Radar was no longer about spotting planes or ships. It became the eyes of a divided planet. Massive radar arrays stretched across the Arctic Circle, scanning the skies for Soviet bombers. Every blip, every echo could mean nuclear annihilation. For millions of people, safety now depended not on walls or borders, but on waves bouncing through the upper atmosphere. The world had entered an age of constant watching, a peace built not on trust, but on detection. 21. The birth of the air age. While generals turned radar toward defense, civilians discovered its promise for peace. In 1946, commercial airlines began using wartime radar to navigate safely through storms. The same technology that guided bombers over Berlin now guided passenger planes over the Atlantic. For the first time, pilots could see through darkness and fog, tracing glowing dots that marked other aircraft and landmarks below. Air travel became faster, safer, and more reliable, a direct legacy of war. By the 1950s, every major airport in the world operated radar towers modeled after Allied wartime systems. The skies that once burned with conflict now glowed with the hum of radar screens keeping travelers safe. It was perhaps humanity's most poetic transformation, the tool that once guided destruction, now guiding families home. 22. The hidden legacy. Yet even as radar entered daily life, its deeper influence ran far beyond aviation. The radar scientists of the 1940s laid the groundwork for an entirely new field, electronic intelligence. Their experiments in wave detection, pulse timing, and signal analysis became the foundation for computers, telecommunications, and eventually satellites. When the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, was launched in 1957, it was radar that confirmed its orbit. When astronauts later traveled to the moon, it was radar that guided them safely home. The invisible world that radar opened in World War II
had become humanity's permanent domain, the unseen infrastructure of the modern world. 23. The German legacy and human irony. After the war, many of Germany's top radar scientists were quietly absorbed into Allied research under Operation Paperclip and Operation Surgeon. They found themselves working in American and British laboratories, helping to perfect the very systems that had once defeated them. It was a strange, almost poetic irony. The same minds that once mocked radar as a gimmick were now building its future. One German engineer, when asked what he thought of radar's evolution, said softly, "If we had believed sooner, the war might have lasted longer. But I thank God we did not." His words captured the haunting duality of radar, a technology that saved and destroyed in equal measure. 24. The unseen frontier. By the late 20th century, radar had become invisible, not just in wavelength, but in awareness. People no longer thought about it. It simply existed, quietly watching over airports, ships, weather, and defense systems. But for those who had lived through the 1940s, radar remained something sacred. A reminder that the greatest revolutions in war were not always loud or visible. They were born in silence, in laboratories, in the hum of a signal bouncing back from the void. The German officers who once laughed at radar could never have imagined the world it would create, a world where invisibility itself became the battlefield. The echoes of those first radar pulses still travel through our skies today, invisible, unending, eternal. Each one a whisper from the past, carrying the memory of a war that changed the way humanity would see forever. 25. The invention that changed how humanity saw itself. Wars end, but their inventions never truly disappear. They linger, reshaped, repurposed, reborn in the quiet corners of peace. Radar was one of them. It began as a whisper in the air, pulses too faint to hear, too brief to see. Yet from those invisible ripples came victory, safety, and a new way of understanding the world. For the first time in history, mankind no longer needed light to see. That idea, that we could pierce the unknown, was more than a military triumph. It was a change in how humanity perceived existence itself. Because radar was not just about detecting enemies, it was about detecting truth. It taught us that the most powerful things are often unseen. The signal in the noise, the pattern in the dark, the knowledge behind fear. To the men who lived through it, the pilots, the sailors, the engineers, the radar operators hunched over glowing screens in the dead of night, radar wasn't science. It was salvation. It meant coming home alive. To the German officers who once laughed at it, it became a symbol of humility, a lesson that arrogance in war or in life blinds faster than darkness ever could. And for the generations that followed, radar became a quiet guardian, invisible, unthanked, but always there, watching the skies, guiding the lost, still sending echoes through time. As the years passed, the laughter of those who doubted was replaced by the hum of airports, the sweep of weather radars, the orbit of satellites, all born from the same wartime discovery. The invisible became essential. Today, every signal that moves through our skies, every plane guided safely home, every storm tracked before it strikes, carries within it the legacy of that invisible war. A war that began when men mocked what they could not see, and ended when they finally learned to believe.